Thank you very much. I think the first thing is to see, can you hear? Yes. If you can't at any point, will you simply rise like a wraith and I shall realise what you're telling me? Because I cannot stand you sitting there on these hard seats if you can't even hear. I don't mind you turning off and going to sleep, but I would hate to have you trying to do that. I feel a bit like Rip Van Winkle, actually, unaccustomed as I am to public speaking at this stage. It was in a weak moment David caught me, because I was in that evaluation or whatever it was meeting, validation meeting that you all have in polytechnics, that I would have never got my course on the ground if I'd have had to go through that. That David said, because I was the president kind of thing, would I come and say something? And I thought it would be like 10 minutes. And then I realised it was more than 10 minutes. You realise that I stopped officially teaching 2 years ago. I have, however, not stopped thinking, because you can't do that. And I've tried to keep in touch, but I am obviously not in the same shoes as you are, who are now grappling with certain kinds of changes. So this is a kind of apology that I may not be able quite to wear your shoes, but I'm trying because I listen hard and try to read what I can. I have not read, quite deliberately, because I could not cope with all the showers of paper you must have been receiving from all those trees cut down. There was no way I could digest the material that is flooding at you, I assume, all over the place, because I'd have just ended up with a quick skim and not known it. So what I'm trying to do in this talk is to empathise and then to offer, because I believe in being positive, the sorts of things that were I still teaching, I would try to do. You are, of course, at liberty to completely reject what I say, as is everybody's right who listens to somebody else sounding off. So feel free not to like what I say. That is your privilege. But I'm speaking from what I believe I would do. Because though you may not realise it, well, you can realise it when you look at my face. I was 36 years in a staff room where people never, ever, ever understood anything I was trying to say. And I mean it. And sometimes when I did a staff seminar, they either didn't notice there was one and didn't come, which is their privilege, or they would sit with baffled gaze and come up to me at the end and say, you know, I wish I deeply would like to understand you. And then on my very last staff meeting, one of my colleagues stood up and said, well, of course, Dorothy declared UDI 36 years ago. Well, I didn't know I'd declared UDI, because all I thought was, if students pay the bill, students matter. And therefore, the courses we build must not be based on chopping the day up, so they're running from one lecturer to another. That's all I tried to stop. However, that's my sort of apology to you if I'm not managing to empathise very well. Right. These seem to be the problems that I hear about from teachers as I still go around occasionally in school staff rooms, and of course people come home. you seem to be coping with an awful lot of paperwork that is coming at you in the way that children have had a lot of all through their school lives. Pieces of paper put in front of them every day. There seems to be a lot of fear and anxiety about this new curriculum, which is pretty old, really. There seems to be a great deal of concern about what is not included. Domestic science and, in your case, drama too, as I understand it. And there seems to be a great deal of worry about being called upon to teach for testing, which is obviously a nightmare. Now, naturally, I think at this sort of time there's the tendency to try and entrench and gang up and try to resist, and that I do respect. Because if you've ever looked at Bales's chart of how things get done in committees, for example, you'll know that when you come to number 7, the sorts of things that get said in meetings are all at the retrenching position, the defensive position, and finally the withdrawing position, which is what Nigel Lawson has just moved down, you know. And it's a pretty desperate thing. I don't mean Nigel Lawson, I mean moving down is a desperate thing. Right. Now, the other thing I just want to say is, I wish I could do tidy, neat talks, but I can't. So I've got a dreadful sort of octopus thing here, because to me, teaching is not linear. Teaching is dense. So all these octopus arms that I'm going to sort of hurl at you, to me, are all there every time I open my mouth or my ears when I'm working with children. So they're all together. But you can't speak with 9 arms, as you might say, so you've got to talk about one at a time, but they're all there, as far as I'm concerned. I shall also have to apologise if I don't get through it all, and you'll have to guess the rest. What an interesting day you're going to have. Right. I thought, what are the most important 4 things, maybe, that I could deal with? So I'll list them now, and of course you've got your homework, which you are going to do this morning while I have my eye upon you. You can follow it up later, and if it's of any use to you. But we will be starting on these sheets, so don't put them away. You will require them later, children. Right. I thought, do I stand up here and say how important drama is? Well, I'm not. Not because I don't think it's important, but it is no more important than an awful lot of desperately important things. And I'm much more interested in teaching children importantly than teaching drama to them. So I'm all for it, but I'm not going to defend it as a little part that is bigger than anything. And when you listen to the latest things scientists are saying, it's so thrilling. Anyway, I will come on to that in a minute. We've got this octopus thing. Right. I thought one of the first things that is desperately important when you spend your life, as I did, frequently as a guest in a school, and frequently helping teachers survive wholesomely so that they're good to be with children, is what are the operant views of children that are going on in that school? Because if the view of children is that they are vessels to be filled, then you are going to be going against that principle if you want to apply the kind of techniques that your art form creates for you. So you'll have to forgive yourself if a lot of the time the paradigm you operate in goes against the paradigm or the major paradigm that is operant within the school you happen, or institution you happen to function in. So you've got to start forgiving yourself a bit and not being neglectful of it, but realizing it isn't all your fault. So I thought, right, the first thing everybody will have to do is take a very long and cool look at the paradigms that are operating. Now, I've given you a paradigm sheet for your homework, if you just have a quick look. You yourself will have an operant paradigm. And at the bottom there are about 14 interpretations of the term paradigm. I've given you the one that I think at the moment would be viable for me to use here. That is, it's an organizing principle which governs the perception of people and determines how and what we will see what's going on. If you see a child as a flower, then you're going to try to open up the little dear. And bring it to its blooming. And it works. I mean, a lot of children are deeply comforted by that sort of kindness, especially the teaching of teacher dependence. So the first area I think we've got to take a long, cool look at is which are the operant paradigms in my school or my institution. Now, you'll find these out by listening at staff meetings, by the way meetings get put up on notice boards, the notices that say no children beyond this point, or no parents beyond this point. My gauge as a guest in school was always to walk down 4 or 5 corridors before I ended up meeting the people I'd come to see. Because as you pass children, you get a good idea of the operant paradigms. Do they pass you with averted gaze? Do they hurry past as if you'll whip them round the ankles as they've gone by? How do they look at you? Do they initiate anything at all once you're in the classroom? So I was always doing this sort of mental arithmetic, because when I got in that classroom with that teacher, I had to have a sense of what behaviours have been created for the children by the operant paradigm. And of course this chart here is related with it, so maybe we'll do a little digression. It doesn't matter you can't see it, because I couldn't write it any bigger, but I will explain it, and I apologise deeply for those of you who have seen it before and are bored with it. But it seems to me an efficient way of reminding myself that most of the time the behaviour of the kids is related with the behaviour of the teachers. So, on this left side, we all know that pupils know a lot. So one of the things we have to do is find our own ways of finding out what they already know. Now, you have a marvellous diagnostic tool in drama, because you can keep quiet. I can't now, but you can usually. You can set up circumstances which enable children to reveal to themselves and to you what they already know. So they come into school with things. They may not register to themselves what it is they know, because we all know a lot more than we realise we know. And one of the problems of tests and exams is frequently people enter the testing chamber and they do not own their knowledge. So they just pray the questions will suit them, because they have no manipulation of the questions, because they don't own what they know. Now then, this is the bit that interests me. Up here, you've got, and I've been given it now, the teacher's control of communication. Teachers have been invested with it. You can make that go off at variable strengths. You can say, I'm listening. Or you can say, hang on a minute, I just want to say something. Don't cut yourself with that, or whatever. That, the way the teachers control the communication, obviously creates the pupil's expectation about who they are and what they're supposed to do and how they're supposed to work, because this teacher will help them know how they're supposed to do it. And they spend their lives reading the teachers to see whether they'll go with it or quietly undermine it or openly question it. Why do we have to do this, miss? I mean, you welcome that, but it's a nuisance at the time if you're worried. Right. Now this is the total semiotics of the classroom, into which the teacher is putting controls and communications, and the pupils are putting expectations. Now, their knowledge has to come through that and survive, and not be left either ignored, like the fact we did Moses last year, miss, but you didn't hear me say so, so we're doing it again with you, you know, and so on. Now, as this changes, if the teacher changes the systems of communication, then the pupil's expectations change. And you're in really dicey trouble sometimes if you start changing the operative paradigm. I had a wonderful privilege 2 years ago of working with, there were 9 of them. There were 9 men, all now working in insurance offices and the civil service and this, that and the other. They were all grey-suited, tied and money-earning with briefcases. But when I taught them, they were doing their A-levels, and I was asked to deal with Pilgrim's Progress up in Felling Highfield School. And one of the lads rang me up from the insurance office one day and said, I've got a letter from you about insurance. I said, you haven't? He said, I have. I said, no, you haven't. You've got it from Dorothy Heathcote, who is a teacher in Newcastle. Oh, he said, I thought it was you that did Pilgrim's Progress with us. So I said, no, it wasn't me. So we got talking, and he said, you know, we never saw that videotape that was made because it was for a PhD from an American student, and she was videoing the week. I said, well, why don't you come along and see it? He said, I'll bring all the lads. And these 9 beautiful, suited, grey gentlemen appeared, put down their briefcases, pulled out ham sandwiches, and sat down. And I was distinctly nervous because my ragbag lot of teachers didn't half look ropey at the side of all these sweaters and jeans, you know. So I thought, what are they going to think about this group of teachers? So they sat down and they watched in complete silence as they munched, of course, for 3 hours. I kept saying, I can cut this, I can cut this. No, let it go forward. So they watched it right through. And then we began to talk, and they said, you know, it's amazing, because that's how we are kind of still thinking. They began to say, look, when I said that, that was the first time anybody'd got me to talk about that. And then they said, I was thinking, oh, very nice, very nice. Ah, yes. And then they put the gloves away and they said, do you know, for 3 days we thought you were mad. Well, I mean, you know that feeling. And I said, what was it that made you think I was mad? You know, they said, well, you sort of moved about, and you were never in 2 places at once, and you didn't stop us betting on the horses. Now, I knew they were betting because they were in their A-level year, their final year, and they were reading the Daily Mirror and the local rag every morning to let me see that they started when they were ready. They did it politely, but they were gone. And then the half-crowns, it was still old money, the half-crowns would come out, and one of them would say, "Can I be excused?" And I knew they were going down Highfield Road, down to the betting shop, which is now a hairdresser's. Such is life, it changes. And, you see, they said, "We thought you were mad, because, well, we asked you at the end, do you remember?" they said, and I do. A boy with very long hair, who now, of course, was short back and sides, said, "Would we get as bored with this way of working as we have done with the other?" And, of course, how could I say no? How could I say, "No, you won't," because I don't know if they will. But, of course, they left school and now they're that. Now then, if you shift the centre here and change that, if you can tackle the paradigm, the pupils' use of their strategies for learning will have to change. Now, some of their strategies for learning are to undermine what you're doing. They are not all positive. However, they will all have strategies for learning which you can extend. Now, you are using a system of teaching, I assume you are anyway, which frees you from the transmission-only system, which is what I'm using now, I'm afraid. So it should extend in many, many ways, with many, many tentacles around the school, so that the kinds of learning possible become extended. Now that's basically the message I have for this whole morning. That if we really can shift the semiotics there, knowing the paradigms we're up against, because you are not a miracle worker, you can keep your feet on the ground and say, "Okay, I tried and I can see why it's difficult. And I can see what a price these pupils will be paying if I ask for a shift of the paradigm on their part as well." Now, we'll go on to paradigms in a minute, but I just want to list the other three things I want to deal with. The second area is, and you've got it on your sheets, what sorts of power have I got in my current situation? And I mean power in benign terms. I'm not talking about authority. Is there anybody I can influence at all? Are there any people I'm compatible with that I feel would collaborate with me, who would support me, that I could be honest with about what I'm trying to do? Is there anybody who would read the publications of the children in my classes, who would look at the walls of my room, who would look at what I put outside if I can? Who are the people? And, you know, you can see that I've just done a few. Is there anybody who would share work? I think a woman in Hexham has worked a miracle in 2 years. I haven't yet been able to talk to her deeply about how she's done it, and she probably doesn't know. She started, when my last MEd course started, as a part-time teacher in Queen Elizabeth High School, comprehensive. She was going in as a relief teacher. She's now permanently on the staff, and she's head of drama. And just recently, she and Eileen Pennington, who works in the north, changed the English curriculum right through the school for a fortnight, and 19 teachers came with their classes and joined in. And they worked in rolling roll. She didn't lengthen the timetable. It was 40 minutes here, an hour there, and so on. But she taught from this central point of rolling roll. Well, you may not know what it is, but I'll go on to that later. And 19 members of staff now are working with that tiny little woman. And she's changed it because she's examined the paradigms and she's looked very closely at this sort of chart and made tentative steps. Very unthreatening. And she's listened at staff meetings, and she's listened to how people reflect the paradigm that they're operating in their classroom. So that's the second thing I'd like to look at. The third area I want to look at will be on the next page, I imagine here, yes. When you went to school, you see, you're not probably typical of everybody that goes to school. I don't know, because I certainly am not a typical teacher, so I don't know if there is one. When you went to school, how many kinds of things did you do in school to get your learning sorted out? Now, a lot of people spend a lot of time copying, writing, listening, reading, occasionally having a discussion, but there's not a big range of things they do when you really seriously look at it. Now, I don't know whether you agree with that, of course. One of my quarrels with my colleagues was the tables were never moved in their room. Everybody was in a folded up position to do the course. So they would come in and fold up and stay folded up as these little chirping things here went on. And then they unfolded up and left. Now, it seems to me that if anybody is going to get people out of being folded up all day, it's because they have thought extremely carefully and looked extremely critically at the tasks they set children. Now, you are in a position to vary the tasks set to children, probably more than any other operating agent in a school. They really don't have to be folded up, neat, square, you know, with their heads beneath their chins, or whatever, you know what I mean, their chins above their knees, or whatever. So I am always very interested in how many kinds of tasks can I set children. Now that, of course, is why my lessons look so hopeless to people who like a nice storyline, or people who like to think teachers never speak or interfere with the drama, or people who think children should be constantly acting out their drama rather than interpreting, reflecting, and so on. So my drama lessons look a mess, let's face it, because I'm intrigued by the way I can take this task for this kind of learning possible, turn it on its head by that task, and maybe review that learning that's just happened. So I'm asking you, or telling you, I suppose, really, a very positive thing that might be done is to closely examine, seriously, how many kinds of tasks do you happily engage children in? And what are the penalties you pay? And how do you protect them into doing tasks that will make them think, are you mad? Or are you? To quote the Olivia ceremony that happened just last week. And that's the third area. And the fourth area, which I obviously am less used to you on, because I think time will reveal that, is good possible to come out of it, this thing that we are currently in a worry about? Might we learn better to think as we teach, to take note and recall, remember, isolate children, recognize their skills? We don't necessarily have to write it all up at the end of the day, not having done something in the way of scrutiny during the lesson. And so that is the fourth area. You've borne with me very patiently so far, so can we now just go to one quotation. Paul Freire and I think, have a lot in common, though I salute him. It seems to me that he could do directly with his pictures to make people think in his reading program, his literacy program, very closely to what I am trying to do in my drama work, because his pictures appear innocuous until you ask the questions. In drama, you can create, and I'm much criticized for doing this, you can create a kind of parallel to what it is you really want to look at, or you can look directly at what you want to look at. The choice is yours, however you want to do it. But all the time, it is the question and the quality of the question underneath that makes the learning possible. So the word praxis is what I want to push down your throats. Because if there's anybody who would tolerate working in praxis, surely it is you. Freire says, the authentic praxis is a function of dialogue. To exist humanly is to name the world, to change it, and once named, the world in its turn appears to the namers as a problem and requires of them a new naming. Men are not built in silence, but in word, in work, in action, reflection. Theatre is action, reflection. Drama is action, reflection. He then says, praxis is a human value means which is explicitly orientated around reflective thought. As such, it suggests action to transform limiting situations, as well as action to augment and extend the work of socially just and pedagogically sound behaviors. The act of knowing involves a dialectical movement which goes from action to reflection, and from reflection upon action to new action. To me, that is the drama classroom. There has to be the task, the action, from which the reflection will arise, which will be then used in new action to create new reflection. We are constantly recycling the work, and that's why, to me, the task is so important. Now, I've lost all my notes, as you might say, so what I'm now going to do is go back and tackle paradigms. I'm saying to you most deeply, do not at this moment listen so much to me as to yourself. They'll have to put the lights out. I'm apologising if there are any teachers here, and I know Ken Byron will know this, who have seen this particular thing before, though I didn't do it with slides. I'm going to use 3 slides of the birth of Jesus. They are paintings. Because the child is at the centre of them. I am not conducting a religious revival meeting. But the child is at the centre, and there are many, many things operant in these. Now, I've just got the original pictures here. I won't know if it's very clear to see. We are going to look a little bit, but you are going to do it, not so much me. Which paradigms are operating on this world as you look at these paintings? I've chosen 3 because one shows shepherds, one shows kings, and one has the animal kingdom in it as well. I couldn't find what I'd call the cliché crib anywhere amongst art. and I wouldn't show you less on slides. Okay. If you regard this as a world in which people will learn and consider and act according to the values that they perceive matter, because we're looking at paradigm now as what is our perception of the world. Now, I'm not trying to make this into a classroom so much, but obviously there seems to be an emphasis that the smallest might be the most important at this time, which was said to you last night by Edward Bond. It does not necessarily mean that they all must be worshipping it, because if the paradigm is, we think you're wonderful, I used to get irritated in America when they would just shout, kids are great. And I used to think, by God, they're not. There's two over there just ruining my world. However, in this particular picture, somebody's thought it important enough to come and take a look at what's going on, to spend some time honoring this being here. There seems to be a fairly equal grouping of males and females, and a fair number of the inspectorate up above. However, if you could just give names to just the little bits I've mentioned, I'll shut up. If you do think the child is central, what kinds of things do you find yourself doing to be sure they realize that? We can see what they're doing. They're just leaving a space and some territorial rights and some honouring, because of course the painter has used his paradigm to give us this message. Quietly listen to a staff room. Where are the children in a staff meeting? I don't mean why are they not sitting in the chairs. I don't mean that. Where are they in the people's heads? If you work in a college, where are the students in the people's heads? Are they pawns? Are they things to slot into minutes? Are they people? Are they groups? Are they ethnic minorities? Groups. If we move to the second picture, John, it's slightly different, because you have others going about their daily business, the world outside, and you have the animal kingdom, and you have the very wealthy now. And the child now is supported. So where are you? We need a kind of language, which I'm not very good at, to say, you know, is it the seemingly most vulnerable, the least useful, will in the end become the most valued? It's that kind of language we have to look at these pictures. Will we regard the presence of the high and the low as equally relevant in this child's view of the world? And how shall we do that? What do we mean by high and low? Are we thinking in terms of the structure of society in a hierarchical situation? Or are we thinking of the meaning of the total existence of this world which we inhabit? Because you see, what you teach, if the how of your teaching is rich, when you start to think about your paradigm, if your view of this world encompasses these things, you're going to have to decide how you will protect and induct this very vulnerable person into realizations and degrees of importance that this particular paradigm can hold for us if we choose to let it. And what of that external world of ships and commerce and all the past behaviors and rituals that are now operant in this picture, that have been selected as being useful to be observed at this point? What will you do? And how much of it will you do? Because if you stick to your little curriculum areas, you'll tend to sort of have parameters that cut things out just when they're ready to come in. And you may be able to bridge these areas. And if we take the third picture, the child is supported and revealed in this picture. And we are not so certain as to who is poor and who is rich in monetary terms. There is a determination to look closely upon the child. How will you look closely at what they already are and know? Now, I only chose those at random, partly because it's nice to look at good pictures, but also it seems to me to just raise the issues. So if we can have the lights on and you turn to that first page, which I think I've got somewhere, I'd like you to just, I will go quiet, and will you just have a 2-minute think about two things. In where I work, what would I think would be the most general paradigm that's operating? And the second thing, what paradigms am I comfortable in operating? What? Okay. It wasn't that you couldn't hear then, was it? No. Right. You've got a list.
What was the second one, please?
Child as can. Oh, the second one. Which paradigm do you deeply believe you are operating in? You might move from one to another, but you'll not move far from your ideal paradigm. Now, I've not listed all of them. There must be hundreds more. This came out with an M.Ed student and I once when we were doing her dissertation, because I always did a lot of dissertations with them. David, please listen. Now I find when I'm teaching, I have a basic one that is my ideal and I care deeply about, and I conducted with my daughter as far as ever I could in my personal life, and I operate like that as far as I can in my personal life, and that is the child as crucible. That is my ideal. That don't sit down on what you think you know, let's change it around a bit and get on to something else. Let's keep stirring our knowing. That's why we listen to Edward Bond, why you're sitting there now this patient way. What can we do to keep being affected by this next stage? That is my ideal, says she, throwing it away. However, there are others that I always know I'm operating in and have to forgive myself. For example, I don't like child as flower. I mean, I never have liked it, because it's a sort of squeegee bully, a sort of rubber bully, you know. And I don't really like child as candle, but occasionally I know it's my responsibility to get the little devils lit up. And therefore I will entertain if necessary. I will lure and beguile, and I have one smile that I haven't used today because I'm not intending to need it. However, I bring it out in moments of absolutely back to the wall desperation. And touch wood, it hasn't yet failed me. But it's like Yehudi Menuhin and his violin. Once a year he lets himself stroke the back of his strad with the back of his hand, very lightly. And that's it for the year. And that's that bit I've got that occasionally is my candle. Child as echo I'm not too keen on, but I occasionally will use it. And it's when I'm saying, listen, there's enough relationship of honour between us now. You know I'm on your side, but do it this way to see what I mean. Will you try it, knowing you needn't like it? So, you know, some of these, I don't like the child as machine. You know, they'll all know these French verbs by Friday or else. You know, is upsetting to me. I can't work that way because I know how thick-headed I am. You know, people would never get me to have all them French verbs by Friday at all, because I'm wandering off in different ideas, like we thought you were mad when you did it, and so on. So when you go back to work, just watch yourself and see whether you're operating the paradigm that is going to confuse the children, because it isn't the same sorts or range of paradigms that the children are having to pick up the expectation about their role in all the other lessons. And in particular, start seeing if you can hear in the staff room talk when you're having a coffee or whatever, what's the operant paradigm there? If somebody says, oh, I've got 4F, they don't necessarily be operating a paradigm, I can't speak English as usual, they wouldn't necessarily be operating a paradigm you wouldn't approve of, they may be just in despair. But it's worth hearing. I'll tell you the one that frightens me more than any, and it's one I hear, and I don't know why some teachers escape it and some don't. I was in a primary school a few weeks back, and I was sitting waiting while the BBC were doing some filming with the children, and I was with the staff just sitting around. And the number of teachers, because they knew me, a number of teachers who came in and said, oh, I wish you'd sort my lot out. At what point do children become adversaries? Now, I thank God I've never seen them like that. But why have I never seen them like that? Is it because I've been favoured? I haven't had the daily grind, and I'm sure there's a factor here. of going in, you know, and coming out and going in again and coming out. But beware of it, because it is death. And I don't think for a moment they were saying it unkindly. But because I read symbolic behaviour all the time, you see, I'm hearing all these my lot out. Sort my lot out. You know, you'd be able to sort my lot out, they were saying. Are you not going to go in and, you know, do half an hour? That would really make them sit up. You know, that kind of thing. Anyway, that's that. And it'll become a whole new hobby for you. It changes your life. Stand in a queue at Tesco's or wherever it is to pay a bill and listen to the paradigms. They're all there, they're all round you. Shut up, Willie! Oh, take him out. Or whatever. And so on. But it becomes quite fascinating as well as, of course, upsetting. Now, if you take your second one, you've got this managerial grid thing. I used to make my students do this at the very beginning of the year, simply to see, when they reviewed their classroom practice, where they most like to operate, but where they feel pressured to operate. Now, you see, if you have a high concern for product, you'll operate in the bottom right-hand corner. And if you're worrying currently about all this testing, this maybe is where you feel you're being pushed to operate. You know, a very high concern for the product, and not a high concern for the process or the valuing of the individuals. Now, I don't necessarily think it need work like that. Because, you see, if you've got a crucible paradigm, and we're going into high-flown theory now, you've a right to turn round and say to me, it's all right for you. You know, you've left. You went off to Mars, or heaven, or wherever. It should be possible with an operant paradigm that is power shared, if you can get children to change their expectations of their role, to work towards a high product for specific purposes. Now, this looks like one is a betraying. But when I was teaching in Kenya, it did not seem to me a betrayal when for 3 weeks I was given 109 9-year-olds, where English was their third language, let's face it. And their English was pretty good, I must say. So I've got these 109-year-olds, and I have to teach their science program, and if they fail it next month, they won't be able to go on in school, which is very scary for somebody like me that knows no science that I own. I actually know an awful lot in practice, but I don't own a lot in theory. So I look at their science, and it consists of 36 questions. What is a thermometer? And at the back of the book, there's the answer they have to be able to give. So I went away and thought, well, I've come here, I said I would do it, and this is what now they're telling me I have to do. Will there be a way in which the children will own enough to get to their next stage of formal education? Now, I don't know. Obviously, the wonderful teacher who let that class work with me out of his hands for 3 weeks. I mean, what generosity, knowing the risks. So I planned that they would run, well, I asked them what they thought was the most important thing to do in Kenya. And they said, save the poor. Because the poor were all round, including in this classroom. And especially the poor people were in a shanty town just across the railway line. And every morning the women were packing up their houses, which were aerial packets and this, that and the other, putting them on their heads and walking with their total belongings across the railway line through the school yard, where the goats were eating, of course, naturally, they belonged to the head teacher. They got the grass. They were walking past here to their chambers, to work all day in their chambers with their houses beside them so the police wouldn't come in and set fire to them. So naturally these children said, we ought to save the poor. So I said, okay, well, we'll see what we can do to save the poor. We could do it in theory, and maybe we could get some people to listen to us, and we'll lecture to them or do something to show them what they could start doing to save the poor. So I've got my 33 questions, or 35, or whatever they were. And they met an Englishman who was a teacher from the university, because I had to get a white man for this. And he was not a terribly good farmer. His accounts were in a bit of a mess. His thermometers were neglected. His rain gauge he didn't even know how to set up. His crops, because they had a lot of crops in their questions, he'd got coffee on flatland, and everybody knows it should go up hillside. His cattle had tsetse fly. I mean, he wasn't even noticing their skins. He was a very nice man. He was not an idiot, and he was not helpless, but he didn't understand this climate. He'd been brought out by his father before all the Mau Mau problems and so on. He'd survived the Mau Mau problems. Kenyatta had just died. He knew about that. The children, of course, were telling me about that every day because they were just electing the new man. I've forgotten his name temporarily. But they were in that, our father has just died. And we had a discussion about this almost every morning as they reminded me about this. And they explained to this man a lot about things are going to change, because our father has died and there might be new laws. We are going to take over your farm, not because we want to send you away, because you've done your best, but really, it needs better organising. I mean, his accounts were in a clothes basket. They were just put in and he didn't go through them. And he didn't know how much his thermometer had cost. Thermometer is one of the questions, of course, that hit me hard. It was one of the first ones. And so on and so on. And we spent 3 weeks helping this man start to manage his farm in this managerial grid system of 5-5. I didn't discuss managerial systems like this to the kids. They dealt with their science materials because they had a farmer who needed to learn that he had to do this. This is how a tsetse fly damage looks on a hide and so on. The teacher very patiently went along with this, and every day this nice man came along. Some days he was more active than others. The children had, of course, very little paper. They were, of course, 100 children. There were no sides to the classrooms. Obviously, the goats came in and out, and this, that, and the other. But that was not important so much, except goats are quite handy on a farm. They were quite useful for my project. Now, I didn't think those kids tackled that series of questions badly at all when I saw the results, which, of course, I didn't see for a while. I did have one God's gift, and that was on the last day of my time in Kenya, the school day, there was their huge farming thing that people come from all over Kenya, the equivalent of the Royal Show. And I heard on the radio the tiny slot of English I used to hear every morning to see whether England was still around. I heard that 2 young farmers were coming to that big show. It gave their names and sort of described where they'd be. And I asked, because I heard of it early enough, I asked if our 100 children could go into Nairobi, which was about 3 miles away, and talk to these 2 young farmers about the problems we were having with our farm. I was able to telephone these 2 young people and ask, you know, would they feel overwhelmed if 100 farmers appeared dragging along an Englishman who was starting to smarten himself up and was beginning to have a grasp. He'd set his rain gauge up, they were working it, and so on. Incidentally, when I looked through that list of questions, I had to go to the head teacher, of course, and say, have you got a thermometer? And he sort of said, well, he thought there might be one. Now, children are taking this test every year. He thought there might be a thermometer somewhere, that they'd once been given one. So I said, well, could I have permission if I stay late and try and find it? So the teacher of the class said, I will look for it because I know where things might be. He found it. He found a thermometer and he found a rain gauge and he found various things I now can't remember the names of, humidity, what's-its and whatnot, in their new boxes, dated 1965. And I'll bet you the staff cupboards now in England with equipment in that nobody is using. I suggest when you start looking round, take everything you can find that nobody else wants. It doesn't matter if it's a very old textbook. They come in very handy. I'm serious. Take it all. It's only wasting itself in cupboards. Put it in your cupboards and you'll never know when you might need it. We set the rain gauge up. I mean, I learned how to set a rain gauge up. So did the teacher. He'd never seen one either. Of course, it didn't rain. I mean, it just didn't. However, we did. We knew there was a tap in the yard and we could make it rain in our rain gauge and tell the farmer, you know, you put this wet coat on this morning because it's rained in the night, and that, you remember, it's rained in the night, your coat's wet. So we would wet a coat under the tap, put it on him, walk across the yard to the rain gauge, and lo and behold, there would be rain in it. And we would teach him how to measure it. The 100 children lectured to the staff in order for me to gauge what knowledge do they now own in order to get through this flaming test on which their lives might depend. It's not for me to say it's a stupid test because I don't have to grow up in Kenya. And anyway, I failed my 11 plus and think where I might have been if I hadn't. The mind boggles. Anyway, you have a look at your teaching. Are you a country club manager? I'm on your side. You matter more than the product. I'll do everything I can to make life extremely comfortable for you. And we'll feel very satisfied with what we are doing. A bit like Willie Whitelaw sounds. There'll be others, but I can't remember names well. But occasionally, you know, it's all... it's all right. Or, do you want to work at 9-9? We are a team, and I'll get you very committed to this work. And again, we'll trust one another, we'll respect one another, but I won't worry you too much about the product. But that high regard for you will be based in mutual effort, mutual respect, and so on. Now, if you come down to the bottom left, you can see the impoverishment. And, you know, you can walk into classrooms and classes can walk into your rooms where you sense the impoverishment. The sorts of questions that you get in Edwards and Furlong's book, like, she hasn't got a pencil. Do we have to write the date? Do we have to do this? Will you tell us this? The child who says to my daughter regularly, have I been good today? Which is just about the end. Have I been good today in your estimation? So that middle one, you see, is quite tricky, because there are times when you're saying, it isn't good enough. We haven't got it good enough. Not you haven't got it good enough. I was very intrigued. I was talking to Gavin and John at breakfast. I heard Ken Livingstone talk on a Monday morning talking programme on Radio 4, where I pick up the world news. Ken Livingstone, they were remembering teachers of history. And various people were talking, including erudite historians, as to what the GCSE history project should be and why there isn't the Second World War in it, or something like that, which you'll all know about. And Ken Livingstone said, the teacher I remember is the one we were at the time scared of. But I remember her because we were made in the most interesting ways to get it done and right. Now, sometimes when I watch my videos, I curl up. You know, they do have a habit of going on and staying around. And you think, oh dear, if only that would fade and I hadn't done it. But there's one little video, there's a video of some young Maori boys and girls. Yes, there are some girls in this. And we are looking at planting bamboo so that we shall own the garden we will run. They said, we want to run the world without adults. But you see, they immediately wanted an adult to join in and tell them what to do. So I had to run the orphanage and make the rules for a while. But when it came to planting bamboo, I thought, this is when I can back off. I said, I don't know how to plant bamboo, but if you want a good hedge around here to stop the wind blowing all our crops out, bamboo it will have to be. I see in that video, I am insisting, and I'm operating at 5-5. The children, because of their expectations, have made me operate basically either at 1-9 or 9-9. They haven't made me operate at all on that bottom two, but I'm trying to get to 5 now, which is, listen, mate, get your own quality in there, not mine. And to do that, to operate at 5-5, I'm saying stop, because the old lady's been given permission to do that. She runs the orphanage. If the bamboo is going to get rightly planted, its roots have to be known. So there I am, you see, doing what people accuse me of all the time, bullying the kids. But you watch their hands begin to dance, and the roots become. And it's what Rollo May says, that we look on the thing that doesn't exist and we make it be. And that's what you're doing nearly all the time in drama. The thing that does not yet exist, even on the parameters of vision, slowly are inducted to be. There's the theatre. And there's the drama classroom. But one would hope you'd need it in science as well, because it is the same tool, the imagination. Now, the thing that gave me great pleasure the other week was listening to Colin Blakemore, for whom I have great respect ever since he did the Reith Lectures, some years ago now, saying scientists are going to have to get their act together and start writing common sense. And he quoted various pieces of writing. Now, one of my great pleasures, because I'm a great reader, but I'm indisciplined. I don't bother about reading what people say I have to read. You see, I haven't read the national curriculum. But I do read all the time. And one of my great joys is reading people of science trying to explain their world to me, in the hopes one day I'll get a bit of knowledge I can own. And you've only to look at Capra, for example, the Tao of Physics, and so on, the turning point. There is a physicist who can write common sense because he's interested in Eastern religions. So he's found a form that suits him. So I thought, right, I'll give him an example of scientific, clean writing that is in our field of art. So I said, right, I'll set myself a challenge. This is a book I used to make all my teachers read, if I can find it. Here it is somewhere, because I had it this morning. Right. This is a book I had to carry around with a brown paper cover, because an elderly lady reading Confessions of a Knife on the metro in Felling is not very suitable, especially at the time I had a black eye. Because I'd walked across my teaching room and fell, and I had this dreadful black eye, and you can imagine what everybody was saying. So I'm reading Confessions of a Knife in a brown paper cover. And it's Richard Selzer, who is a surgeon in New York. I recommend the book. It is very important reading for you. Right, it's not Deer, it's Paladin. It's called Meditations on the Art of Surgery, underneath the big title. So I said, right, I'll let that book fall open at any page, and I'll read them the bit that it falls open at. This is his chapter on skin. And he's writing as a surgeon. I sing of skin, layered fine as baklava, whose colours shame the dawn. At once the scabbard upon which is writ our only signature, and the instrument by which we are thrilled, protected, and kept constant in our natural place. It's sort of holding me in, you know. Here is each man bagged and trussed in perfect amiability. Ain't that lovely? See how, and in my case this is very true, it upholsters the bone and the muscle underneath, now accenting the point of an elbow, now rolling over the pectorals to hollow the grotto of an armpit. I don't know where my pectorals are. You notice the vague gesture. I've just realised where they are because I read about armpits, you see. That's what I mean. Anyway, I'll just finish this bit. Nippled and umbilicated and perforated by the most diverse and marvellous openings, each with its singular rim and curtain. See why it's necessary reading for you. You're never the same again. That's my skin when I have a bath, you know, I mean, all the time. Thus, the carven helix of the ear, the rigid nostril, the puckered continence of the anus, the moist and sensitive lips of mouth and vagina. And he goes on about bone and God knows what. Kidneys, liver, stomachs, you know. Very good reading. The point I'm making is, you are not the only clever guys, the people that teach drama. If you can't go into their world and acknowledge it and try to cooperate in it, I don't know what people like Richard Selzer are on the earth for, and Capra, and loads of people, because once Colin Blakemore had given a book list, of course, I started to get them. And that's why I'll never be rich, of course, you know. Anyway, that was the managerial grid bit, which you'll need to look at through your practice, your praxis. And you'll have to be honest. And there'll be times when you'll have to function at 1-1. And there'll be times when you feel pressured to function at 9-9. Now, we have not yet harnessed pupil power, and we jolly well know why. Pupil power could start to get harnessed for 9-9 so that it could operate benignly. But for pupil power to operate, you've got to change the praxis. So if I know I'm rushing on now, I should be stopping, but I'll just go to the next chart. If I can move this board, it's a tricky board. This funny bump is not the beginning of angel's wings or a monkey's tail. It's that microphone. Well, I wouldn't like you to think that my upholstery has gone a bit off, having heard about the skin. John Carroll invented this when he was doing his PhD with me. And, well, he didn't do it with me, he did it with himself, for goodness me, he didn't need me, but never mind. If you're in transmission teaching, and I apologise if you know it, shut your eyes and go off a bit. Obviously, the teacher has to constantly assess how the pupil's learning. You've got to keep assessing, because that's the only feedback you'll get of what has gone in, like today. I can only assess by seeing whether, in fact, you're thoughtful as well as entertained, you know, and so on. The pupil's communication is to present work for assessment. It needn't necessarily be written down, but it might be, what do you think, John, about what we've just said about Magna Carta? So the pupil is presenting. And of course, when you come to the thing everybody's doing most of, is both teacher and pupil, because teachers are usually honourable, at least I have to go on thinking that, because what else would you think? They are each presenting to each other their final, most wise, most perfect draft. So if today I'm going to explain Magna Carta to you, it will be, presumably, the best I've got to date. And I've been thinking about it, not just learned about it 20 years ago, and I say the same words every year, on the same date. The child presents their final draft usually in their best handwriting, or in answering the question and sticking to the point, and so on. Now, if you take the bottom line, and you look at inquiry methods, the predominant teaching role is to reply and understand what the child is grasping for, to respond and understand, and therefore, presumably, to feed more into the inquiry system. The child has to agree to a sharing role, that they share their inquiring, they share their inquiry with this other understanding, sharing person. And what they end up with is they both explore the circumstances that they've set themselves to understand a bit more about. Perfectly laudable. But don't mistake these two polarizations either for ways of working we should never use. Because if I want to know the way back to my hotel, don't make me explore it. Just tell me. Because that's a time when I need to know how. Because it matters. If I want an ambulance, don't say, well, now, what would you think might be the best way? You know. The main thing is, isn't it, is the self-monitoring that says, Okay, mate, forgive yourself for a very firm transmission session. And why it's necessary. And if somebody challenges, you'll have to have your answer. The drama framework is neither of those. And therefore sometimes it looks quite punitive. Because there, the teacher participates and contributes from their adult knowing. But they obviously choose the systems that don't work at the transmission ways. The child has to agree to a cooperative, benign response. Now, you will know if you visit classrooms that, well, certainly it's happened to me, I've spent probably 90% of my teaching life changing a rat-like, suspicious class who thinks I'm mad, perhaps, like the polite guys that were betting, or who are saying, well, I'm not listening to you, mate, you've got no to say to me, you're an old woman, into a benign, open responder class. And of course the miracle is, kids are so great, they do. Kids are great, you see. But it's amazing how they turn around. And the third one is, and this is the bit that seems to me so important, they end up explaining to each other what they think they now understand about the world, what they think ought to happen under these circumstances, which is the praxis bit. Because if you've decided or been lured, beguiled or whatever into looking at it without the prejudice of we don't do this in school, or we shouldn't have to do things like this, or nobody looks at art, or this isn't drama, miss, this is art. What are we looking at pictures for? Why are we drawing? It's supposed to be drama. We should be in knickers and vests or whatever. So I hold this one quite importantly, and it goes with my managerial grid. Now I'll just have to skip and skip. If you look at the third one, it's the tasks, because the tasks are going to be all used in this band here. How will the task, I am hoping they'll do, setting up so that they can do, beguiling them into doing, create this operational system whereby they explain to themselves and to me. I recently, just before I retired, did a teaching project with 9-year-old children and one of my M.Ed students on ritual. How far do children appreciate that society operates a lot on rituals that sort of smooth the way? I've lost the relevant bit of paper, but I'll try and remember it. And we just ran a paper factory. We printed things. In this case, we were printing Chinese money for a very important person who wanted Chinese people in England to be buried with the Chinese ritual paper objects that they'd have had if they'd have died in China or Singapore or Hong Kong. We examined with the children what is a habit, I'm sorry about this, I'm going to forget them. Ritual was the fifth one. The first was, well, we do this because, that's how we do it round here. And it went on, I won't waste your time trying to find them, through 4 different things. That in the end, you see, if they're all operant, when habit has become ritual. And frequently, rituals then disappear from view. You no longer recognize them as ritual behaviors. You've stopped noticing. And we then got these 9-year-old children, because it was near to Christmas, to teach some 6-year-old children about habit, pattern, I've thought of 2, and ritual on Christmas celebrations. So we could assess again, understand what they'd understood. So so we're back up there for a minute. Can we assess and evaluate what the children who've run this paper factory for a week now own knowledge on in the matter of habit, pattern, so on, and ritual? And that seemed to me, quite a reasonable way for them to do it. I have to end. So I'm going to end with a writer who is very important to me. And I think she's very important for what was said last night as far as I could hear it. And that is Doris Lessing in this marvellous series of essays called Prisons We Choose to Live Inside. And again, I recommend it to you. It was a series of lectures commissioned, and I think there are 4 or 5. On page 48, she's discussing group minds. And she says, "We, the human race, are now in possession of a great deal of hard information about ourselves. But we do not use it to improve our institutions and therefore our lives." She then, I'm cutting to a further lecture, which is called Laboratories of Social Change. Now, if you examine that, you have a laboratory. You don't have a laboratory there because laboratories have responsibility for publishing and sharing, not keeping what they know, and not just exploring. They have to define, as far as they are understanding, where they've got, so that others may join them in the enterprise. So it's there that your classroom is a laboratory. And one would hope eventually schools were. But of course they can't be until we look at this last chart, if John will give me 2 minutes. I want to read this, and I apologise, it's a little bit long. She's talking about what will the establishments be for, if we could get them to be laboratories of change. I'm talking about people who think about what is going on in the world. There's your Friera again. Who try to assimilate information about our history, about how we behave and function. People who advance humanity. There's your Friera again. It is my belief that an intelligent and forward-looking society would do everything possible to produce such individuals, instead of, as happens very often, suppressing them. But if governments, if cultures don't encourage their production, then individuals and groups can and should. We are back with the concept of an elite, and that is all right with me in this context. We cannot expect a government to say to children, you are going to have to live in a world full of mass movements, both religious and political, mass ideas, mass cultures, that every day and every hour of every day you will be deluged with ideas and opinions that are mass-produced and regurgitated, whose only real vitality comes from the power of the mob, slogans, and pattern thinking. You are going to be pressured all through your life to join mass movements, and if you can resist this, you will be every day under pressure from various types of groups, often your closest friends, to conform to them. She's saying you can't expect governments to ever say that. It's too dangerous. Machiavelli said years and years ago, didn't he, in The Prince, if you try anything new, your friends won't support you overtly, your enemies will immediately denounce you, and the people who would help you will come quietly afterwards and say, I did approve of what you said. And I've had a lot of that, actually, in my staff room. It will seem to you many times in your life that there's no point in holding out against these pressures because you are not strong enough. But you could be taught how to examine these mass ideas. This is you coming up the bank. These apparently irresistible pressures taught how to think for yourself and to choose for yourself. You will be taught to read history, I hope, so as to learn how short-lived ideas are, how apparently the most irresistible and persuasive ideas can and do vanish overnight. You will be taught how to read literature, I hope, which is the study of mankind by itself, so as to understand the development of people and peoples. Literature is a branch of anthropology, a branch of history, and we will make sure that you will know how to judge an idea from the point of long-term human memory. For literature and history are branches of human memory, recorded memory. To these studies will be added these new branches of information, the young sciences of psychology, social psychology, sociology, and so on, so that you may understand your own behavior and the behavior of the group, which will be all your life, both your comfort and your enemy, both your support and your greatest temptation, since to disagree with your friends, your group animal, will always be painful. You will be taught that no matter how much you have to conform outwardly, because the world you are going to live in often punishes unconformity, it's nearly finished, and death, to keep your own being alive inwardly, your own judgment, your own thought. Well, no, we cannot expect this kind of thing to be in the curriculum, laid down by any state or government currently visible in the world. But parents may talk and teach like this, schools may, and groups of young adults who have run the gauntlet of state education or private education and survived with enough of their critical faculties intact to want more than they have been given may teach themselves and each other what they will. Such people, such individuals will be a most productive yeast and ferment, and lucky the society who has plenty of them. Now it seems to me you've a choice. You can get yourself out of the system, and you can't rise a loaf you're not allowed to mix with. Or you can say, I'm going to look very long, hard and cool, and I'm going to strive in the way I can with my personality and the kinds of tasks I wish children to engage in. It does not matter two hoots to me personally whether you're the so-called improvisation lot or the theatre arts lot. I'm sick of that stupid argument. It doesn't matter, provided whatever you do, whatever material you use, arouses the spectator. The spectator during an exploratory, inquiring, explaining situation is the spectator that is inventing currently. The spectator who is at the interpreting level is now at the watching how the message is formulated, and that is the theatre end of it. It doesn't matter so long as the spectator is alive. And just one last bit here, because this is a way you can gauge. When I'm teaching, I'm going round this whirlwind. Is it all right just to take this? I operate on prodigality, giving people all they want as much as I can, in order to operate at the artist's role of parsimony, to do a lot more with less, which is what your artist does. Your explorer needs a lot, and they gradually pare it away. So the teacher is operating constantly. Do I give them a lot here and let them mess around with it? Or do I say, no, I'm cutting down now. Take that away. You don't need it. Risk it with me. I'll help you. Or can I get them to shed it on their own, which, you know, you like better? So I'm always in these areas of, when am I the provider of materials and the preserver of the dignity of the people? So if you think of little children, that's your play group. You're setting things up so that they're thinking, they're feeling, they're making adjustments to these objects or whatever they are that are around, and their initiation of things and their judgments about things become operant. You decide the point at which you cross that line, and as soon as you cross that line, your language shifts. The whole structure of the social semiotics shifts, because now I'm becoming guide and stimulus. Okay, I've let you go through 36 pieces of wood. I didn't worry that you wasted a fair amount of paper there. I'm going to start now, though. We'd better put this wood away that we don't want anymore, because somebody else might want it later. There's a way to cut out by using just a bit. If you only want a bit, you needn't cut it out the middle of the sheet. I had to do that with some teachers last week. They were doing Silas Marner, Practical Approaches to the Novel, and they actually cut out his cottage out of the middle of a 4 foot by 5 sheet of paper. You know, and, you know, naturally they were excited. They wanted it all, you know. At this point, you see, you start either offering some knowledge. Hammers are better if you hold them at the very end, or whatever it might be. You offer them some skills, and you see what skills they've got and what they'll tolerate taking some trouble over, and you start setting standards. And it might be just a little bit like, you could get it smoother than that if you want. There's some finer sandpaper there, if it's at that level. Or hang on a minute, do we think this monk's sandals seem right, you know, for him having to walk all the way to Chesterley Street in these, you know? When you come on to this one, of course, you come on to the point at which most teaching begins, where children are folded up. And that is, I instruct and I direct. So children say, do we have to put the date on? And so on. And when you get to this stage, you are deliberately saying, in whatever tasks you set, now then, we're going to get this mastered. There's a way to write a report that works well because it does this, this, and this. There's a way to label finds in an archaeological dig. There's a way to write business letters to Chinamen who want orders for death money. There's a way that we welcome people. We've thought about this very carefully when they come to our factory. We've thought it out. And the motto we have chosen is, and this is what the children said, strong runneth smooth. That's the paper going through our printing thing. Strong runneth smooth. And they thought this was right for our whole lives. If we were strong, we could run smooth through all these hazards and so on. And then finally you come to a stage children don't get much of, which is time to realize what they know. It's the sort of thing I did as a child because I'd got a mile to walk up a hill. So we used to practice things. We used to practice jumping over puddles and seeing colours in the oil that used to leak and we thought was petrol. You don't see much of that now in modern cars. A whole waste of colour sense as far as I'm concerned. Testing yourself. This is what runners are doing. All the Olympics people spend an awful long time in these two areas. If they go into that area, it's when footballers start saying, OK, we'll do ballet and see. So they move into another play area till it starts to be incorporated. Now, I always know the point I've crossed the line. And when I cross the line, I might cross that line with some children, that line with others, and that line with others. All the time, because they're all at different levels. And, of course, if you work in Manford the Expert, they can all be at different levels. because you are functioning as an enterprise. And people are busily getting on with it to the very best of their emotional, intellectual capacity. So they can all function like the real world does. You know, the idiots are going along with this, but they're not idiots when they go along with that. I'm going to have to stop. I thank you very much for patient listening. There's an awful lot we haven't done. But, yeah. I appreciate what you've done. I do not need Mrs. Thatcher's 7 minutes, though. You've got to get your coffee. Thank you very much.
Can I, on your behalf, then, just say some words of thanks? It's easy enough to introduce Dorothy. It's almost impossible to thank her. I think there's 7.